So, welcome everyone to this second edition of IFLA's Futures Club. Futures Club, it's an early part of our centenary celebrations. IFLA will be turning 100 on the 30th of September 2027. We'll be starting the celebrations formally this August, but we wanted already with the Futures Club to start bringing you in on some of the work that we're trying to do, because what we want to see is not that the 100th anniversary, of course, it's an opportunity to look back, to celebrate all of the people, all of the decisions, all of the initiatives that got us to where we are today. But it's also an opportunity to look forward to the next 100 years, to draw on this past, to learn from this past, but really to also to have a sense of agency as we go forwards, to think purposefully, constructively, confidently about the future of our field, about the future of the communities that we serve, about the future of the values and missions that we hold so dear. So what we're looking to do through the Futures Club, especially those who weren't able to join us for our first one with Matt Herkelak and Masoud Khoka, we're looking to have conversations simply with people who've done some of that thinking, who are involved in trying to move the library field, support the library field into the future, who've experimented with futures thinking to some extent, to share those experiences, to learn from what they're doing, to take away ideas that hopefully we can apply all within our own settings, but also to interact a little bit. And so while this session will start with a conversation between Patricia and me, we really welcome you to put your questions in the chat, to ask, to share your ideas, to share your thoughts, to ask your questions. It's going to be quite a free-flowing session. We don't have presentations, we're just going to be talking, and so it'll fit in quite nicely with that. So to introduce Patricia, it's an absolute pleasure to have her with us today. I'm conscious it's just gone 8 o'clock in the morning in on the east coast of the US. So thank you for joining us so early. So Patricia Hswe is the Program Director for Public Knowledge at the Mellon Foundation. I'm sure that many of you have heard about the foundation. If not, I certainly do encourage you to look at their website. There's fantastic material up there. The foundation itself has a very long record of investing in change in order to realize the potential of public knowledge to improve lives. The program on public knowledge has as a mission to make grants that strive to increase equitable access to and activation of recorded knowledge in order to help build informed, heterogeneous, and civically engaged societies. Patricia herself is a librarian. She used to work at the libraries at Penn State University, where she co-led a team of librarians providing services in research data management, digital scholarship support, and library-based publishing. She's also worked at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she was program manager for a set of grant initiatives funded by the Library of Congress and by the Library of the Institute of Museum and Library Services. So a really great experience both in working within libraries, and of course those are academic libraries, but you do a lot of work with public libraries as well, working at the institutional scale, but also at the national and the global scale through the Mellon Foundation. So it's really fantastic to have you here.
Thank you.
I suppose I'll start with a question. I know you can introduce yourself further. So I think a first question we included is to talk a little bit about the work that you do within the public knowledge program. And in particular, it's a point that you bring out in an interview that you did with Mellon colleagues a year or so ago, focused on
Mhm.
the transition from a former program that was focused on scholarly communications, now to focus on public knowledge as a theme.
Mhm.
So it'd be great to talk a little bit about what has that meant and what does that mean? What's your job today?
Um, Thank you so much, Stephen, for that introduction. I really appreciate it and for inviting me to be in conversation with you and the IFLA Futures Club. I think it's a really great idea to bring together thought partners and practitioners and leaders into this realm. So about the question, this was really interesting when there was this shift from scholarly communications to public knowledge because I was hired initially as a program officer for the scholarly communications program 10 years ago. Actually, it would be 10 years ago, August 1st. I will have been at the foundation for 10 years. So
Congratulations.
thank you. Thank you. So when I joined, I was immersed in, you may say, all kinds of issues and challenges having to do with scholarly communications, which is, at base, the ensuring that there is access uh, to and discovery for scholarly materials that may be primary sources, for example, that may be scholarly literature, and to ensure that we are keeping up with the times and the pace that scholarship and research, teaching and learning are doing in terms of the digital environment. So many of our much of our grant making in the Scholarly Communications Program supported digital humanities, you might say, and digital scholarship in the humanities. Also supported publishing, scholarly publishing, especially as many presses were trying to figure out infrastructure for the publication of digital monographs. So that was led by Don Waters. He led the Scholarly Communications Program for 20 years until he retired from the foundation in 2019. And then a year later, we became the Public Knowledge Program. And I think that shift reflected an understanding that we want to make room for a wider range of institutions, kinds of institutions. We had primarily been a funder of academic libraries, for example. But we also understood and understand that much scholarly research is drawing on primary sources, for example, that aren't necessarily found in institutional archives. So, what is our responsibility to ensure that there is access to those materials and an understanding of the communities that are trying to steward them? To that end, we began to support directly, and that means not via only subawards and regrants, but directly to community-based archives. These are archives that are all over the country, all over the territories, all over the world. In fact, in the United Kingdom, I think there is an organization that is devoted to that cultural heritage, the cultural heritage being promoted by community archives. In our, I'll just give you this example as an example of wanting to make room for other organizations. We realized we had never made grants to them directly. And so these organizations are small. They're largely volunteer led. They are telling the stories of cultures and histories and peoples that may not be captured or reflected in institutional archives. So, an example of that is Asian American history. It's the rare university library that collects heavily on that history, for example. That history has been collected mainly by community archives, such as the Historical Society in Little Japan in Los Angeles, such as the Densho Project, another Japanese history project, such as there are community-based archives focused on Hmong communities in Minneapolis, for example. So that was a key reason wanting to make room for other kinds of nonprofits, cultural heritage nonprofits that may not have seen much Mellon funding. That was a reason, one reason. And then you mentioned public libraries. While Mellon has been a funder of the New York Public Library, a prominent funder, you might say, that has been historically, that has been because of the special collections, the research collections that the New York Public Library holds. But we had not really been a funder of other kinds of public libraries. So that shifted when we became the Public Knowledge Program. And in the last several years, we've been funding Chicago Public Library to support the Vivian G. Harsh Collection, research collection. We have also been supporting public libraries with something called memory labs. And those libraries are, and there are many of them, some 60 plus across the country. Those libraries are helping their communities reformat and digitize video cassettes, tape cassettes, all kinds of photographs, all kinds of physical materials that they cannot preserve on their own, but that are very important to their family heritage. Um, so if that all makes sense, that is those are two key reasons wanting to be more than a scholarly program, let's say, but wanting to be much more of the community and of the public.
That's fantastic. I think that the logical shift, which of course makes perfect sense, of realizing that you focus on digital humanities. Of course, the humanities in particular are going to
Mhm,
rely on a much wider range of materials, and so realizing then in order to ensure that, the effectiveness, the sustainability of
mhm.
digital humanities, then you actually need to go to the source and make things and make things work. And there's a couple of questions that sort of came out for me from that. I think I know that experience in particular of going into those community archives, and I know maybe
Mhm.
that was the case already, but of building up a sense that they are also part of the scholarly record. I don't know, being careful about terms there, obviously, but
Yes.
elevating them and breaking open this idea that there is knowledge that is scholarly and there's the
Mhm,
rest. I don't know,
mhm.
what's your experience been of, I don't know, has it been easy to convince people in those situations and those communities that no, there is this value, they're doing something important and that's more widely recognized?
And when you say communities, do you mean the academic community or do you mean the communities of those archives?
Local communities, so the communities that the archives are archiving.
Right, right, yeah. Well, the as with many institutional archives, these archives are open. Most of them, many of them, are open to the public. I mean, that's sort of their bread and butter is being able to create programs around their materials and around their communities. So it was less, there was some relationship building that we had to do, obviously, as a national private funder. But on the other hand, many of these community-based archives were already familiar with Mellon because of having been on grants that were led by higher education institutions. And so what was maybe a small group of them that we were familiar with that grew mainly because we held open calls for proposals from these community-based archives. The main motivator is what your question is, I think, getting at, and that was we really wanted to see what archives would come out of the woodwork to apply that we could learn about. This was an intentional uh, um, activity or call to help us learn more about these archives. The first year, I think I can't recall exactly. I think we got more than 200 applications. We ran it for 3 years. Each year, progressively, the applications increased. Last year, we ran it, and we were thinking we would run it for another 3 years, but we received almost 1,100 applications, and thought, well, that might take care of 3 years if we can fund a good number of them. And it may have been 1,100 registrations or applications. At any rate, it was hundreds and hundreds. And so through those open calls, we've been able to understand better what this world of community-based archives is like. And there's been a lot of trust building and relationship building. We want these archives to feel empowered and to have agency. And so we make it a point in the call that these archives will not be going, the grants will not be going to higher education institutions. They will be going directly to the archives. And that's a decision. I mean, it's the rare instance that a community-based archive is located in a higher education institution, but by and large, they are outside of those institutions, and that's by design. Those community-based archives want to be able to tell their stories and their histories on their terms. And so hence, their standalone archives.
So I imagine in particular, it makes sense when we're talking about communities that, for good reasons, will have felt not particularly well represented or not particularly well documented by sort of more mainstream approaches. It makes sense that you want to keep things relatively close.
Mhm,
I don't know. It does, and it'd be fascinating. It's obviously, I don't know. I don't know, around 1,100 applications implies a huge sort of, I don't know, a
mhm.
level of interest in that. To, to what extent does actually getting, I don't know, doing something outside of the community, bringing in a source of support from that isn't within the community. Does that, that requires a change of mindset? Do you come across sort of challenges in, encouraging that sort of change and, I don't know, as you said, building up that trust?
Yeah. One thing that I think has been helpful is, I mean, that was the most recent call, and we'll have to determine again, when we hold another call like that. And it may be that because of the scale, we may want to work with various intermediaries. But I think what really benefited, what helped us was when we did the first one, it became a signal, especially to those who had been on Mellon grants before, a signal that wow, Mellon really cares about ensuring that we have direct support and that we're not just sort of almost an afterthought, on various grants because. What was happening with the grants that did engage community-based archives was that these archives would not share the design of their proposal. They would not have a sense of the overall project budget. And so they didn't feel that they were full partners, on an effort that was a large grant from the Mellon Foundation. The other thing too that I would say, it does take time for a national private funder to build relationships with these communities, these archives. But one thing that we did was make sure that we showed up at important points. And I'll just mention that in 2018, we funded Shift Collective to hold a convening of community-based archives. And it was really a symposium where leaders of these archives and even scholars of them, because there are some archival studies faculty who have studied these archives and really lifted them up through their teaching and learning and research. But it was our coming together with other funders. IMLS was there. Council on Library and Information Resources was there. I think that made a difference. And I was at that gathering, and it was my first time certainly meeting leaders of these archives. And I was just blown away by the experience and being able to talk in person with various archivists from these organizations. So I think that's been important, when it's showing up to make sure or to affirm these archives. And various staff on my program have done the same. So there's trust that comes a lot from that kind of interaction.
And I think that point about taking the time, I think showing up is such an important thing. Obviously, there's a fantastic record of well-meaning anthropologists and sociologists and so on, gate crashing communities and writing about them, and then to taking the next taxi out of town. So actually taking that time to do
Yes.
that makes a huge amount of sense. And just to make the obvious IFLA link, I know certainly that this topic for those who are familiar with our trend report, the first trend being about the nature of knowledge, the understanding of knowledge is changing and actually
Yes.
getting into that space, but actually the practical implications of what it
Right.
looks like to recognize a wider variety of materials as knowledge. And it's not
Hmm.
just flicking a switch. And
Right.
it's
Yes,
certainly not just
exactly.
ticking a box and like buying a new collection. It's something, I don't know, it's something far more invested.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. If I may add to that too, I think this has something for librarians and archivists who work in institutional settings. I would love to see community work, that librarians and archivists do who are of those settings, be taken as or be considered as important, not only important service work, but important to an understanding of research practices and teaching practices and learning practices. I think what happens sometimes in those settings is that it can be seen if you are not at the desk, at your desk, for example, or, you're not the reference desk, or you're not on site, it may be misconstrued. And you're doing community work. You are building relationships by being in the community, learning about their materials and their archives and how they steward them. If you are not there, there may be some misunderstanding that you're not doing your work when actually you are. It's just that that kind of work impels one to be off-site and to be in community with the people about whom those archives that the institution may be interested in supporting in some way are. So I think there are some um, there are more learnings I think that the profession could do to understand better what it means to be in community.
I think that actually leads on to it was another question I had down as I was at a couple of meetings last week in Brussels, and the buzzword that everyone was using was slow science.
Oh, interesting. Slow science.
Kept on getting, I don't know, because Europe's had slow food for some time, and so you've got
Yes.
slow travel because night trains are in now, and so the idea of slow science has also it's bubbled up within I don't know, maybe elsewhere in the world. It was definitely kicking around in Brussels, but
Mm-hmm.
also that realization to do slow research, in this case, to take the time, it does also require a culture shift.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, scholarly communication definitely has a culture and
Mm-hmm.
quite a sticky one, quite one that is potentially resistant to change. And
Yes.
it'd be interesting drawing again on your work in that space. And I think the development of a discipline like digital humanities is potentially an interesting way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
What in your experience has worked in supporting that change in attitude, that change in what you appreciate, what you value, what you see as being worthwhile within the scholarly sector?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because I think there are some shifts happening even in philanthropy. Um, so, uh, and there are many factors. So I'm almost like not sure where I should begin, but with and I would be interested in hearing what the definition of slow science is. But I have a feeling that it's basically there's not a rush, right? And so in the work that we are doing in public knowledge, I'll introduce the example of Indigenous knowledge sovereignty. We have been doing a lot of grant making in support of Indigenous knowledge sovereignty and Indigenous data sovereignty. And what that means is basically in Indigenous communities, they have their own ways of knowing, traditional ways of knowing, right? And we want to be able to honor that by ensuring that they adhere to those practices. And oh, slow librarianship. Yes, I think I'm familiar with that book. Thank you for the reminder. But to ensure that they have sovereignty over their own knowledge and sovereignty over their own data, we have been supporting things like language revitalization that is happening in those communities on their terms and using technology that Indigenous communities have developed. Um, that kind of grant making can take more time than your usual, let's say, 3-year grant or so, because there needs to be a lot of consensus building, relationship building, trust building, to ensure that this philanthropy is not trying to use them or exploit these communities in any way. We're actually wanting to take their lead. We want them to lead, in these efforts. And so that takes time. And there is literature about slow archives, developing in community archives that are important to Indigenous cultural heritage. And what that also means is understanding, what archives that are held by, let's say, held in federal repositories in the U.S. need to be returned to Indigenous communities. We have not engaged in that work to the extent that our arts and culture program colleagues at Mellon have. But what we're interested in is the research that needs to be done to understand where these materials should go, how they need to be re-described, because very often what happens is that they're inappropriately described. Um, so all of that means that we need to take time. It takes time to adjust, uh, what has been, let's say, misconstrued culturally or inappropriately culturally, described. And there's a lot that Indigenous communities. It's a very group decision making kind of experience, and so we know that that also needs to happen on its own track, on its own path. And I think that yeah, that is very different from the usual, sort of world of philanthropy that wants things to happen quickly, wants results to happen quickly, and for those results to have great impact. What if the impact were more like, well, this community was able to contribute their own understanding of cultural protocols. It took a couple of years to do that, but that's actually, to me, that's impact, because it's impact that means that there was a relationship that was being built. There were sensitivities that were being acknowledged, and as a result, there is a changed mindset, for maybe the non-Indigenous staff or contributors to the project that they may have experienced. So I'm all for. I mean, we can't do every project at that pace, but I think it's important to do projects at that pace where it's very clear there needs to be a community-wide understanding of and participation in what is happening.
So I'm wondering if we need to now write a book on slow philanthropy or something like
There
that.
has been that term. There
It's
has,
been that good. It's
yeah.
doing the rounds.
Um, I mean, there are other parts, right, that need to probably go faster. I mean, I think about, the philanthropies that are very involved in addressing climate change and climate resilience. There's not a whole lot of time, right, that kind of change can, should be happening. But I also know that, given to use the word climate in another way, given the current climate, it can be challenging, to do that kind of to do that kind of work. So yeah, I guess it depends on the problems that one is trying to solve. But I also feel that when you do things at the pace of the leaders of the grant that may come from community-based archives or Indigenous communities, it's worthwhile, and it's standing up a value, of trust. Things take time, at the speed of trust, right? So I'm very much a champion of those kinds of efforts.
Well, and I think that readiness to sometimes break away from the standard model of grant giving, and also because philanthropy, like anyone, there's an expectation of results. There's obviously a desire to make sure that the money that's available has that the
Hmm.
maximum impact it could be
Hmm.
doing, but the readiness to be flexible there, it's a good model for anyone else who's working. I know obviously it's not like everyone else has lots of money to give away, but I know everyone is working to a sense of results, to a desire that we need to deliver something by this point in order to show our N+1s, the next one up the chain, that things are happening. So that flexibility is, it's a very positive thing. I think.
It is, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a balance. I think we try to strike a balance. There are some efforts that need to happen at, a steady pace, and the results and the impacts, that come from that are very often, they're measured, they're measurable, they're quantifiable. But we also have a balance where there are projects that are much more of the qualitative, right? Impacts of storytelling that can emerge from those efforts, storytelling that enlarges, on the histories and cultures and of various people.
Well, and then I think it's what you're saying, finding that balance as well, and finding the right way of doing it. And I think also, what you were mentioning about developing those protocols so that it's possible to actually, to some extent communicate different ways of thinking and organizing and thinking about heritage, thinking about objects, thinking about knowledge, and doing so in a way that's never going to be perfectly aligned with what's
Mm,
happening within communities, but at least makes it sufficiently communicable to have that discussion in the
yes.
first place and to avoid stupid mistakes
Right, right.
on the
Yes,
parts
right,
of
right.
others. So
Yes.
one thing you mentioned is it's not on the list of questions that we previously discussed, but you mentioned that, for example, this is a space where also your arts and culture
Hmm.
colleagues are quite strongly focused.
Hmm.
How do you see the interaction, the sort of the complementarity between the focus on knowledge and the focus on arts of culture? Because of course there are cultures where the words knowledge and
Yeah.
culture are not wildly far apart.
Right,
Whereas
right.
in
No,
Western cultures, we tend to sort of divide them up somehow.
yes, you're right. It's, this is one of the things I treasure about that I treasure at the foundation. And I should probably mention that public knowledge is one of five program areas. So I've mentioned arts and culture. We also have higher learning, which does grant making mainly to higher education institutions. We also have something called humanities in place, which is about physical structures and memory keeping, on land, and that physical structures often reflect. And then we have the Presidential Initiatives Program, which is Elizabeth Alexander's program. And the areas that get focused there are Puerto Rico, um, Imagining Freedom, which is elevating the learning and education and arts of those who are incarcerated, and then monuments, the Monuments Project. So with arts and culture, I mean, they're very complementary, aspects to these programs. Arts and culture focuses on the visual arts and performing arts, museums, and basically galleries, and archives, and can be a part of any of those, right? So, but there are objects. They're much more object focused, I would say. And so there have been some rematriation, repatriation efforts that arts and culture has been supporting to do right by Indigenous communities and their knowledge, their ways of knowing, and their culture. So the way that we complement, I would say, arts and culture is we're very much about the back end of things, you might say, right? And they're about some of the back end too, but it's about the objects and the performance, whereas we're about those things that might support the storytelling that you see in a curated exhibit, for example, because of the archives that support those objects. And what I was thinking about in terms of repatriation is even though it may be understood where those artifacts in federal repositories actually originated from, it may not be completely, the whole story may not be there, in the description, for example, of that artifact. And so there's research that needs to happen. And there are various, you might say, archives outlets of the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, that are in these various communities that can be consulted. But there are also offices called Tribal Historic Preservation Offices, and those staff are very much engaged in understanding better. The materials that not only they're stewarding on site on their, let's say, in their tribal communities, but also materials that may actually belong to those communities but are in federal repositories. I'm not sure if that answered your question, though, Stephen.
No, I think it does. I think I suppose a crucial thing. It underlines, I don't know, that there's heavy interlinkage between
Mhm.
the two sides of things. I think that I don't know, and again, it's something that maybe we don't always see so much in Western cultures is the idea that knowledge and objects are often
Right.
attached, and I think that it's something. It's a permanent annoyance for us when we're looking at, for example, the work of organizations like UNESCO, is that they
Yeah.
put the library and the knowledge in one side of the building, and they put the arts and the culture and the creativity in the other
Yeah.
side. And it feels like
Uh-huh.
a huge missed opportunity because somehow we see, the intangible written as
Yes.
somehow quite different. And but then I don't know, it's nature, culture, it's those sorts of divisions that aren't necessarily so helpful. But by
Yeah.
the collaboration that you have internally, and
Yeah.
looking at it, it's showing a different way of dealing with these things.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, I think the common ground that arts and culture and public knowledge have is we're both invested, albeit in different ways, in collections. So, on that point, there was a collaboration when we were the Scholarly Communications Program and Arts and Culture was Arts and Cultural Heritage. There was actually a collaborative grant making program where, okay, so if we have collections in common, what might it mean if on a university campus that has a museum as well as an academic library, what would it mean for them to collaborate in some way? And it was a very interesting, grant making program. And I think some efforts meant that, oh, well, if there are collections, that we're all sharing, why aren't we thinking much more intentionally about federating these collections and enabling search across them? And that's something that actually happened at Yale University. Now, and the reason why that's important is because so much research, teaching and learning is interdisciplinary. So if you're looking in one collection that may have to do with, I don't know, the medieval history in some way, but it connects somehow to another collection that's about the environment. I'm just making things up. Why wouldn't it be possible to search across collections to find those materials that may be pertinent to that multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary study? So, so we do, confer with our colleagues in arts and culture about these concerns. And with our work in community-based archives, there's a lot of appreciation for intangible cultural heritage, as is the case in our grants that are supporting Indigenous knowledge sovereignty. A lot of intangible cultural heritage there. And arts and culture is, if you think about performance art, and if you think about the most contemporary, let's say kinds of dancing, there's street dancing, there's house ballroom. How are these being documented? How are these being archived? How are these moves being recorded so that they can be shared with future generations or even current dancers who are interested in building on that performance or duplicating that performance in some way. So yeah, there are lots of synergies, I would say, across program areas, and I'll just mention one more if I have the time to do so.
What's this?
Higher Learning has supported the creation of centers that are supporting Indigenous studies or Native American studies and departments. And where we are complementary is that we're about the primary sources that are important to those disciplines, and Higher Learning is about the curricula and to some extent, scholarship that is important to those areas. So that's also another complementarity that we've been able to strike.
And that's also fantastically useful to be able to look at both at the same time, because of course the scholarship and use is not the best word, but I'll use it again, conscious of the limits. But actually doing the scholarship and doing the teaching is a practical use case of what you
Hmm.
do with collections, but then doing that in a way that is respectful.
Hmm.
I don't know,
Yes.
I don't know, it's fantastically practical. Obviously, you can either invest in the one or the other, but then it doesn't necessarily offer you that sort of, I don't know, that complete opportunity to learn about how to do things better.
Right, right. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And I was going to, and you also brought up obviously the I don't know the work of libraries, the work of museums, and so on. And I think we're always conscious that in the development of librarianship, and it's only been a move towards professionalization, this sense that no, this is a profession. We need to teach people to act in certain ways, to follow certain codes, to follow certain protocols, and of course the development of library education for many years goes there. But of course
Yes.
that brings with it the risk of, I don't know, again, poor word choice, but professional isolation,
Hmm.
going down the path of, we have a very specific skill set on this side. And the risk then of actually realizing that we're doing things differently to the way the museums are working or the way the archives are working. And that
Right.
requires a degree of relearning and a degree of
Mm.
flexibility and realizing, well, we think of things differently, and
Hmm.
maybe we've been taught to value different things. And so
Mm.
getting to that stage, and especially with pressures in many countries on the budgets for these sorts of for these
Yes.
institutions, a necessity to both, maintain the uniqueness of the profession and the skills and the
Right.
values, but also
Right.
that openness to work with others in similar sectors who fundamentally share the same understanding of the need to preserve and the need to, make the past available for sort of ethical use in the future. I don't know if you
Yes.
picked up much from some of that work across libraries,
Mm.
across libraries, museums, others about that the coming together, what it's like for professionals
Hmm.
within the same overall heritage sector to work
Right.
together, the experience of learning to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think in many of our grants, we do see a wide, range of skill sets that various people bring to a project. It's not unusual for there to be a librarian with subject expertise, for example, to be on a project. I'll give one example of a project that's at Northwestern University, and actually has to do with climate resilience. This is a project that is digitizing environmental impact statements. Northwestern, I think, is um, institution with the largest collection of these impact statements. Now, some of these have been digitized already and are shared through HathiTrust, which many of your many IFLA members may already know about. But in this particular grant project, there needs to be a subject librarian, the person who knows those environmental impact statements, right? There also needs to be faculty and other types of users of these environmental impact statements, and there are those that's represented in the project. Then, because this project is using generative AI to some degree, and we can talk a little bit about that in order to bolster discovery and access of the digitized materials. There needs to be somebody who is well versed in, that kind of technology, let's say. So it's a very interdisciplinary project. It even has some representation from the School of Journalism because of how important journalism is to an understanding of climate resilience. So you're absolutely, I mean, but I think your question is getting at, like, do we have an understanding of some of the specialization needs? But that's also in tension, perhaps, with those in librarianship who maybe have a more general kind of position. I don't know if I got your question correctly, though.
It's just going back to the you were talking about the example with Northwestern with that series
Mhm.
of different, information knowledge focused professions, so journalism, AI,
Mhm.
librarianship. Um,
Mhm.
the experience though of those different specialisms working together, and
Yeah.
how straightforward that was, and from your role as the grantor, as the program
Mhm.
manager, did you
Mhm.
pick up anything from there about the experience?
Mhm.
Same,
Yeah.
all different ways of thinking, different language, potentially different ways of thinking about ethical questions and so on.
Interesting. I think one thing that this project reflects is experience. The person who is leading it has long experience, I would say, in leading interdisciplinary projects. So he's well versed in technology. He's well versed in what the humanities are about because he's a PhD in English, actually. But he's worked in libraries for a long time, and so he understands librarianship and the various, I would say, expertise or specializations that librarianship can bring. And he understands special collections and archives, having been an English PhD who had to study primary sources, right? So there is that kind of understanding of the breadth of experiences that you have to bring together and almost like braid for a project for it to have the the meaning, the significance that you want it to have. I mean, it's not just digitizing the rest of this collection. It's also about making it usable, right? And it's also about historic understanding of the changes happening to the environment. But I will also say it's true that it does integrate aspects of generative AI. And one may wonder, what is an environmental collection doing in and integrating generative AI? And this is a climate resilience grant. So that's exactly the question we asked the prospective PI, because we want there to be an understanding of, well, how carbon aware, let's say, would the platform be that they're developing in order to make this collection more discoverable, accessible, and usable? Is there a way to get at that? Is there a way to understand better the impacts on the environment in using or in developing that platform? And so we've asked for that. And in most of our projects, and I won't say that it's a standard yet because I think we have to come up with the what we mean by a standard, but in projects so far that have supported some aspect of generative AI, we are asking for that research because we want to understand much better, how is this impacting the environment every time someone is going to use, let's say, generative AI to populate metadata for a collection. I don't know if that's findable, but I would hope that we can do some research to understand how to make it findable or how to understand it better.
So, and that's a super valuable piece of work because, of course, figures get sort of kicked around in terms of water and electricity and carbon use for a single
Mhm.
search and so on. But there's a huge value in if we want to move forward, having a reliable way of looking at this, and that at least then provides a meaningful input for decision making.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've also asked about questions of labor, for example. If this is going to make supposedly, let's say, metadata work easier, then what's the impact or what is the effects? What are the effects on labor issues and practices, for archivists working with that collection, let's say? I don't want to just assume that everything is going to be better because there's a tool that can make metadata creation faster, basic metadata creation, let's say, faster. I do want to understand, where's the sweet spot for that to be implemented and for an archivist or special collections librarian's work to then be able to be taken to the next level, let's say. I don't want, I want to articulate it in um, a much better way, but I mean, what are the possibilities, let's say, that don't detract from the experience and expertise that they bring, but actually enables them to apply that experience and expertise even more.
And again, and this actually is a topic that came up in the first Futures Club session that we had, and actually the degree to which there was a degree of dislocation that an
Mm,
AI does bring that because it is taking on tasks that people carried out and that people find fulfilling, that they
mm,
find valorizing, and it's their opportunity to do something and to get to the end of the day and have actually achieved things. And when the
yeah,
machine takes that over, that it has the potential to be traumatic, or with good change management and good support, it could also be empowering. But those are two extremes,
yes,
and you can definitely be somewhere in, I don't know, if a lot of things again to be sort of in the middle on that. I don't know, I think
mm,
mentioning, given that you brought up an AI, and of course, we're talking about the nature
mhm,
of knowledge today and what is public knowledge, both at what's
yeah,
produced, what's actually taken on board. I'd be fascinated, and this is one of the questions that we talked about before.
yeah.
I know that, I know what have been sort of the most interesting takes on AI that you've heard in the last few. It's AI. I was going to say months. It feels like I should say weeks or days, given how much gets talked about this.
Right, yeah. Takes or hot takes. But no, I won't do any hot takes on AI. But Well, one thing I do want to make sure, I always try and remind, I usually even, I don't know if remind is really the right word, but I try to let people know that well before, generative AI sort of has infused everything just about. We were supporting projects that integrated machine learning, let's say, and natural language processing. I mean, these are algorithmic methods, right? Very closely related to AI. I mean, of course, machine learning and large language models very, closely related. So we were doing that kind of supporting that kind of work, especially in the context of digital humanities projects, where, for example, there needs to be a data set that's refined for text mining, let's say. And so machine learning applications will be integrated into that kind of work. So we're familiar as a program in supporting various AI methods. When it comes to generative AI, I mean, obviously that has just been a tidal wave for many professions, not just librarianship. And there's a lot of concern that we're seeing it, right? We're seeing layoffs of workers like from Meta and other companies that are now trying to deploy AI to the extent that they feel that they don't need a human doing the work anymore. I don't believe that's going to happen with libraries and archives, but I also realize that there's a lot of critical refusal of AI in these spaces, and as well as, just exorbitant enthusiasm for in some of these spaces, not all of them, right? In some library and archive spaces, but not all of them. I'm of the mind that you need to balance things. Yes, be critical about it, but also perhaps, understand that there could be sweet spots. My children who are not fans of AI always tell me it's not impossible, mother, to find a sweet spot, actually. But I think there could be, and that's where I'm hoping, that some of the recent efforts can emerge, can surface some understandings of about what those sweet spots are. I also want to let folks know that Mellon and other philanthropies have contributed, are co-funders of something called Humanity AI. And that is an effort led by MacArthur Foundation in the United States and involves funding from Ford, Mellon, Doris Duke, Mozilla, Schmidt, I believe, and Omidyar. I mean, a host of funders who come from the humanities and arts, but also funders who are known for their technology support, coming together to help ensure that the future of AI doesn't leave people out, and that it addresses things like humanities and culture, democracy, security, and a host of other things. So that you can find it if you do a search humanity on Humanity AI, you can learn more about it there. And it hasn't issued an open call quite yet, but I think that is coming in the latter half of the year, something to look out for. Because I think what that group is very interested in is the humanness,
Mm.
like where is it important for humans, and I would say probably in every aspect of it, to be the priority, in AI.
That's going to be fascinating. It'll be really interesting to see what sort of projects are being called for as well, because of course there's quite a lot of subjectivity
Hmm.
in things. I don't know. We've heard in previous IFLA events this year that
Uh-huh.
whereas for one person, simply talking to a computer, having a chat with a computer
Right.
seems quite
Yes.
normal, whereas for others,
Right.
the ick factor kicks
Yeah.
in very early, and you just don't want to do anything like that. So I think that exploration, but I think also that opportunity to think about what is uniquely human
Hmm. Hmm.
is quite
Exactly.
valuable, and of course to have the sort of the combined power of all the foundations and the funders behind it is
Hmm.
I don't know, and the timing is I don't know, the timing is definitely good. I think we are beginning to see, and we
Hmm.
are seeing in different ways I don't know, governments feeling that something needs to be done, but also coming with that a risk that they will take knee-jerk reactions and will have very
Right.
rapid moves that just forget some pretty key things.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm hopeful that that communities around the country and around the if not around the world as well will become more informed. I mean, data centers, there are companies that are trying to build data centers in many parts of the United States, and I think there's momentum building um, among communities that are fighting back against building these data centers. So I'm hopeful that, they'll be able to be successful in some areas, maybe not all. And I also realize that that there's just a lot of work to be done and a lot of understanding and um, yeah, understanding to be achieved in terms of what the actual impacts on professions could be. I don't know if anyone has heard, this came to my attention because of reading about philanthropy on a regular basis, but Anthropic has is about to invest, I don't know what it is, 500 million or something, to help nonprofits. Maybe it's 50 million. I can't recall the exact number, but it's millions of dollars to help nonprofits, nonprofit staff in nonprofits understand how to work with AI tools um, uh, in such a way that it's basically, I think it's more than literacy, but just basically understanding the value that they can bring, but also the value they can bring to humans, that is, staff can bring to the use of those tools. Um, and it'll be interesting to see, whether this is a trend from that happens that, where companies, not just AI companies, but other companies invest in their staff to, to develop. Um, yes, Andrew, thank you. Has a phone. Yes, that owns a set. Right. Um, yeah, so I'm hoping that, there, like I said, there can be a better understanding. And if that understanding means we should be doing it far less in some areas, then I think that's not a bad thing. But I think it's, the debate will carry on for sure in the next few years, not several years.
And there's plenty of other full stop with electronic, and again referencing back to our trend report, there's plenty of other things
Yes.
through the technology where we probably need to do it less and just get
Yes.
doing that. So one question, I'm conscious it's something that we'll be looking to do with the library field as a whole as part of the first phase of our futures exercises, encouraging people to look back at comparable turning points in the past or comparable moments in the past and think about how we can learn from them about how we got to where we are today, but also learn lessons that we can use for new challenges coming up. I
Mhm.
know with the library field, obviously, there was the internet. Okay, the internet it's not the same as AI, but it's
Right.
still a massive technological change that hit the field that changed a huge amount of what libraries do, of the functions of people within the library. And from your from experience, from what you've seen, from what you've heard, do you think there's any conclusions we can take from the library field's experience of adapting to the internet that we
Oh,
can apply to the way that the library field can potentially, work with, respond to, integrate, embrace, reject AI?
that's a really interesting question. And I think there is some recent writing or conversation about this. On the one hand, there's a camp that believes that this is similar to to the internet sort of infiltrating, the library and archives world, and some concern about, for example, catalogers being out of jobs because of OPACs, online catalogs. And I don't know, and even before the internet, like machine readable description, let's say, that was also a threat. This seems, a little bit more because of generative AI and the ability for anticipation and the ability for that kind of platform to almost I mean, to get accustomed to your thinking and to your rhythms and things like that, it's different and very different. And so I can understand that there are a whole host of different concerns, as a result. The other thing too is that we are at a different time than when the internet started to, become a daily part of our lives. It's a fact. And there is an kind of an assumption that it will always be available, that it's because of the internet, a lot of things will always be available. It's ubiquitous, right? It's not only on your laptop, it's on your phone, it's on your watch. I mean, it's everywhere. So I wonder, what that means when AI is a part of all of that, and you're able to have, things written for you. You're able to have parts of your job done for you. The internet didn't do that to this extent. So I think it's almost a different mindset that has to be, um, I don't know whether it's cultivated or developed, but some understanding that if this is going to be the future, and still to be determined how much, to what extent, I suppose, but if this is going to be the future, then what do we need to do to make sure that our expertise is adaptable, but also relevant, to that future? Um, I think about prompts, for example, and I am not the person, the expert to ask about anything AI. I would say I think you need to probably engage somebody else who maybe isn't in philanthropy. But I think about prompts, and I think about this concept of prompt engineering, and how it's very similar to a reference interview, and how librarians have been trained to ask certain questions, and but also to respond, with those questions, right? To listen carefully to what their patrons and their users are asking for, or like curious about, and be able to craft the questions in response to that. It's similar to prompt engineering, and I do wonder sometimes whether, and this is not to say that I'm all for librarians learning how to do prompt engineering, or to be trained in I'm not. I'm just saying that there is a parallel there, where we already know how to do a lot of that work. So, what would it mean, to experiment with refining, how to do it in the context of using a generative AI tool, with, let's say, a primary source collection that's been digitized? Um, so that's an example, I think, of where the shift of from the shift from no internet to internet is parallel, perhaps, to the shift from no generative AI to a lot of generative AI. Are there already, skill sets that can, I don't want to say can be conformed, because I don't think it's conformed. I think we have the agency. Are there skill sets where we have the agency that we can bring to a generative AI tool? And I don't think I'm saying anything that is honestly unique or extraordinary, because I think the library field and the archives field are already thinking in these ways, and thinking in ways that perhaps the internet, the rise of the internet didn't necessarily prompt, but should have, perhaps, earlier. And I'm thinking here of the archives protocol for AI, or the AI protocol for AI archives. I think I've got that wrong, where at UVA, it started by UVA and now is accumulating more partners in that protocol. Where if you are going to, they're saying to those who want to use AI on their collections, if you're going to do that, then here are all the criteria that need to be met in order for your tool to have access. Thanks, Andrew. And I think that's telling, that because with the internet, we didn't have, there wasn't as much of a movement toward that. And there is now, but I'm just fascinated by the conversations and the debates that have arisen as a result of UVA putting out this protocol, because of there's so many in the library field who are about open access. And this is about something quite different. But are there ways to, again, achieve that balance? So anyhow, again, I don't think I'm saying anything that's new, but it has been on my mind ever since this protocol was released.
Oh, but I think it's fascinating. I had a busy week in Brussels last week, but I was also talking with someone who'd been involved with Google Books back
Uh-huh.
back in the day, and who was saying that the whole process and on all sides, people were feeling their way. It was
Yeah.
something that hadn't been done before, and on all sides, people did things that maybe, in hindsight, they may not have done, and
Right.
it's led. I don't know, it's led to antitrust. It's led to internet
Yes.
search, which is arguably a good thing, given that it allowed
Yeah.
you to find things. But it was not. It was imperfect.
Right.
But
Right.
actually learning that lesson from, okay, we've done Google Books, we saw what that did. Do we want to think again about how to do that now?
Yeah.
And doing so, but also doing so in a way, and I think you also highlighted this, that we probably stay, I don't know, we're conscious that there are some quite strong views, either sort of the AI evangelists and the killer robots folk on the other, and
Right.
how to sort of, I don't know, find a way that goes down the middle. And I think work like that at the University of Virginia to produce a document that at least provides a basis for discussion.
Yeah.
Fantastically
I think
helpful.
it's really I think it's well it's needed absolutely needed and I'm all one for I'm thinking about through debate and discussion how to kind of like wade through this and come up with even better approaches honestly so I see that yeah the lessons learned from Google Books are many that's for sure and I can see why that's one of the motivators of standing up such a protocol. But I'm sure, I mean, I think too, we all know about OpenAI and other AI companies wanting to get their hands on special collections and archives in order to source their, large language models, to do machine learning for those. And we're concerned as well. I mean, but that's one of the reasons why we have been talking with various universities about this phenomenon and trying to understand better. What can a philanthropy do to counteract some of this some of this predatoriness, I guess one might say. It's a question, and I don't know that we have a solution yet, but I think being aware of that kind of movement, that kind of activity and organizing is really important to understanding what the future of our grant making should be.
And actually, and it brings me to one of the other questions we did have on the list. But I think there's instinctively to me, it feels quite valuable to be looking at questions like that from broad perspective of public knowledge as a concept, because you can go at it looking from the copyright perspective, and things will look a certain way. You can go at it looking from the sort of the competitiveness, industrial growth perspective,
Yes,
things look different. I know the US government is clearly going at it from the perspective of, I don't know, what is best for our national economic interest.
right.
That's also there, but actually that more, I don't know, I'm not sure if it is quite cross-disciplinary. I think the idea of seeing public knowledge as a goal and as an area that's worth working on explicitly
Hmm.
potentially gives you some interesting entry points to a specific topic like access to collections for the training of LLMs.
Yeah.
I know it'd be fair, just because you have that range of focus, it'd be interesting just to get that sense of the benefits of having that public knowledge as a thing, focus
Mm-hmm.
what that brings to reflection about AI and inputs to outputs from.
Hmm. I think with so one thing that it has occurred to me, it's occurred to me and my team in recent months, is that as a public knowledge program, we have been supporting more of the knowledge part of public knowledge, you might say, because of our commitment to, let's say, broadening access to primary sources that may not be in institutional collections, and broadening access to primary sources that tell the stories of Indigenous communities. But may have some restrictions, on them because of cultural protocols within those communities. So it's been much more on the knowledge part of public knowledge. And I don't know that I'm answering your question directly, so you should probe more if that's not the case. But one of the things that has been kind of tricky for a program is it's called public knowledge, and there's an assumption that in being called public knowledge, we are about media, creation of media, journalism, and those kinds of activities, and not so much about the activities that support the humanities, let's say, which are most of our conversation has been about. So we have been thinking a little bit about what would it mean to concentrate more on the public knowledge. How does that change anything? Does it mean different kinds of grant making? If we think about the current state of government information and the challenges to stewarding that information because it is openly available on the internet, but how could it be made more discoverable or accessible? Is there something there? And then we've also we know there's a data rescue project. There have been other projects that are about rescuing government data or creating better access to it. So we have just given, and then public libraries, we are increasingly supporting public libraries. What does that mean? I would say among the funders, current funders that are supporting public libraries, there's a focus on civic engagement and civic education, which I think is really important. Our support for public libraries has been largely about memory work. And so if we're thinking about public and public knowledge, is there a place for memory work in that emphasis in the context of public libraries that can be much more of a much more integrated in civic engagement? I think one can't really understand civic engagement without understanding histories and and doing memory work. I think actually those two are quite connected, but I don't know that there's anyone has come out and kind of like talked about that or shown that in various efforts. And I confess that I could be completely ignorant. I'm sure there are projects that speak to both and that somehow knit together memory and civics in compelling ways. But we're always looking for this, like I said, the sweet spot for our grant making where we are distinctive from other funders that may be doing straight, kind of like saving archives or whatever, and those that are doing much more civic education support. We're about the humanities and the arts. So what does that mean for us? And what does civic engagement in that context mean? What does memory work in that context mean? So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but please probe if I haven't, and I'll try to do so.
I think you have because I think I really love that focus on the connection between memory work and civic engagement, and I'm going to
Mhm.
massively oversimplify things, but it's also because it relates to something that we certainly come across in some of our global advocacy work.
Mhm.
It's very simple to focus either on the supply or on the demand side of knowledge.
Mm.
And,
Mhm.
and so, I don't know, for example, one of the things that, to be honest, irritates us quite a lot with work around information integrity and what a healthy information environment looks like is it's
Yeah.
very heavily focused on the supply side. So it's about
Right.
regulating big tech and supporting
Yes.
journalism, which of
Right.
course is super important. But unless you're also then thinking about the demand side, like, I don't know, do people actually appreciate these things? Do people have the skills they need? Do they have the ability to create themselves and to see themselves reflected? It always feels like a very one-sided agenda,
Yeah.
which always risks of tipping over into capture, paternalism, I don't know,
Yes.
pick your sort of consequence of capture. And
Right.
that idea of, obviously focusing on the importance of the collections, which I don't know, let's call supply, and then
Mm-hmm.
connecting it with civic engagement, which is much more about the demand side of it. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry, I'm feeding all of this microeconomics, which I'm sure is a terrible frame of reference for a lot of this stuff.
That's okay.
But nonetheless, it's actually putting the two together. And
Right.
there's always the risk when we're talking about AI is that
Mm-hmm.
people come up with technological solutions,
Mm-hmm.
maybe
Mm-hmm.
lovely and fantastic, but they don't actually, I don't know, they don't always take the human
Right.
factor into account. And so doing
Yeah.
making, doing projects in a way that does actually connect
Mm-hmm.
those different sides and
Mm-hmm.
allows us to look at some of these emerging questions in that way is again from the point of view of the way we try to advocate is really important. Of course, that's something that libraries are there for. They're that place where there is
Yeah.
both a care for what works for the community, and there's a care for what is the supply of knowledge that we can bring in,
Right.
and a care
Right.
for how can we activate that knowledge by bringing together those two sides. So, and I
Yeah.
do really like that. That the combination of the civic engagement and the work on heritage is, I don't know,
Mhm.
it feels like a really good example. It's something I don't know. I'll be happily talking about when we do our advocacy work.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's something that I'm definitely exploring more. And I see where you're coming from in terms of activation of the results of, the supply and the demand. And maybe one thing to add there is I've always been I've always prioritized um, what is the use of, a digitized collection. It's great that you want a digitized collection. It's great that you want to be able to do this research or scholarship, but it has to be broader than just you. And so, what are the different ways that one can think about uses of a collection? It's very important to me because use is directly related to preservation. If something is not getting used frequently, then the likelihood of it getting preserved and attended to and stewarded properly is very little. So I always want to know, what you're doing, how is what you're doing going to enlarge on the usefulness of the collection, the archive, the platform, whatever it is, honestly, that's being developed, um, because that lets you know what the future of that particular effort is going to be. And there are any number of efforts that have had to stop, have had to sunset because it had its time, right? And usage or users at a certain point wasn't necessarily a question anymore. And then there are other efforts that have been able to persist because there is a community, or there are communities of users that are not only using the platform, but also providing feedback on it, requesting new features. And something similar can be said about archives and special collections that have been made accessible via digitization or that are born digital. The more they get used, the more their future is ensured. Um, so I don't know if that helps at all, but I feel like that's where activation is so crucial because activation is related to long-term stewardship.
No, and I think exactly, and I think there's, and I'm simply rephrasing what you're saying. And sometimes there's too much of a sense of, I don't know, build it and they will come.
Yes, right, exactly, which not necessarily,
Oh,
right?
and I don't know, but if you fail to build doors and
Yeah,
accessibility ramps and signposting and turn the lights
right,
on or anything, they're not coming.
right, exactly. Yeah.
But also, you know, it's that logic actually. I know, and this is my sort of feeble segue into futures thinking. But
Uh-huh.
given we've got
Sure.
8 minutes late, 8 minutes left, um,
Hmm.
and that incorporation actually that probably changes the decisions we make around how we do things today to a large
Sure.
extent. So no, so I think that yeah, I think that's exactly what I think. It's good
Hmm.
to see you're focusing on that because I think it's something that we can all probably get better at. So I
Hmm.
suppose just moving on to the futures thinking element, I know in
Hmm.
the past that I don't know that you have awarded grants to support work around how to encourage a stronger focus on the future within libraries, how to
Hmm.
develop not just the knowledge but I guess also the attitudes and
Hmm.
the, sort of I don't know, the psyche necessary to get better at integrating the future into what we're doing today, to get better at dealing with the uncertainty that's
Right.
coming up. And I think you talked also a bit about the importance of there are certain skills that it pays for us to have in order to be ready for that. It'd be great if
Mhm.
you could talk a little bit more about, I don't know, your activity, your grant making activity in this area and what you've learned from it.
Oh, gosh. Okay. This that's a good question. I know that was in the list of questions. So I think that, one of the things that we want to help ensure anyway through our grant making is that there's always some thinking about um, building on, and I'll just talk about skills, I guess, again, building on skill sets that exist. And I don't know that our grants have been specifically focused on, futures thinking, but I can speak to some of the things that we've been hoping for as a result of some of our grant making. So one of the things that I think some our most recent grant making actually not even the most recent, but even grant making from starting from 5 or 6 years ago is thinking about change in an organization. And I know that change management is a really difficult, it can be a really difficult thing to have to oversee in an organization. But one of the things that I think our grants have been able to do is think about, how do you integrate community work more into a role? And I think that's also, something that one has to consider about the future that do we really want to, I think academic libraries want to be much more of the community. Well, if that's the case, how does that happen? And how does your workforce need to adapt in order for that to happen? And also, has the library done the laying of the groundwork, the laying of the foundation necessary to see whether this is feasible or not? And if not, then what would help get the library there? Maybe it's more partners, in the community. Maybe it's partnerships within the university itself. We all know that town-gown relations are really important in any university setting. So, what's possible for libraries to learn, from those efforts that are building community via collaborations between universities and the cities and the towns that they are in the midst of. So the future, I think, is going to mean more community building and integration and understanding. And then I think about the library as a community too, and archives as a community in an institutional setting, especially we're thinking about academic institutions. What's the community building that an academic library is doing? And I know that it happens all the time. Having been in an academic library, I know that we are invested in that community building. But I also wonder, to what extent are we missing out, on potential communities and building trust with those communities? Um, and is it, how should we be thinking in new ways about that? I know that as an academic librarian, early in my career, I had a role that no one else in the library had up until I came. And you can bet that I was doing a lot of community building within not only my library, but also outside the library because nobody understood what I do. I did. And I really had to foster a lot of not only engagement, with other librarians, but also with faculty and students who were engaged in digital scholarship and digital humanities efforts but didn't, really see how the library would be of service to those efforts. There were certain faculty and students who did, but more broadly, that wasn't the fact. And, even Penn State was an early adopter of electronic theses and dissertations. But until after I got there, we hadn't really thought about multimodal dissertations and how one would be able to support that. If a student were very interested in doing much more than just a written, like uploading a PDF of their dissertation. So thinking about like the what ifs and what technology can bring to something that's traditional, I think is going to be really important. We've had some conversation about that. And I guess the last thing, because we are kind of like getting to be out of time, the last thing I might say is that anytime that technology is being developed, it's not the technology that's the most important thing. It's always the people. It cannot but be the people. And that's something that, I tried to model when I was an academic librarian, partnering with software developers on an institutional repository service that would ensure the preservation of and access to the scholarly outputs of the university and its various campuses. So, there's always going to be human. I think the future is full of humans still and not robots. And I think we also have to adapt in some ways to, right now we're always thinking we're constantly connected. And I've been reading some of the work of Amelia Acker, who teaches at Rutgers University in the School of Communication and Information. And she has some provocative writings of late that are about what would happen if we put data at rest? What would happen if we somehow thought about not always being connected? What if we thought about, um, yeah, I mean, just basically not having everything, not having connection be ubiquitous. She also, is thinking about data and the ability to sorry, I'm going to be you should just read her book. Amelia Acker is her name.
Yeah.
She's written a book called Archiving Machines, and it's about from punch cards to platforms, and it's about the centralization of platforms and how we need to be thinking differently about that. Like, and I think about this in terms of the changing environment. Like, why aren't we thinking much more about putting things at rest? Because we may not always have the energy, the grid, that we have access to now. So shouldn't we be thinking about adapting to those kinds of situations and not letting it necessarily color, our understanding of access, but just how we just need to be thinking differently because the future is upon us. And climate change and AI are upon us. Anyhow, I'm again not saying I don't think I'm saying anything new, and I'm saying things that others have iterated. But I appreciate the time, and it's really cool to see Marcy online too, because we used to work together at Penn State.
Ah, fantastic. No, but so I'm conscious we are now at times. I think some of the final points that you've been making are actually extremely relevant to where we are. That there's certainly, the logic of technology is, and because you can do things in a centralized way, you do, and because you can be connected all the time, you are, and actually that readiness to question that and say, well, maybe not. And I think your example of, I don't know, certainly tech vendors will try to say, well, this is your magic solution that will do absolutely everything. And of
All
course,
right.
we have an interest in doing that because that sells stuff. And in the same
Yeah.
way, like the amount of free publicity that OpenAI got when ChatGPT first came out, and like I never saw a single advert, but everyone was talking about it because they did
Yeah.
such a good job of getting everyone
Yeah.
to actually talk about it. And the fact that having to advertise now is fascinating. It implies
Mm,
they can't just trade on that. But
yeah.
does also imply, well, I know we don't need to believe the marketing messages, and I know we don't need to be sold on the simplicity. And it's actually that effort that you talked about of sitting down with the software engineer and saying, well, we don't just have to accept what we're given
Hmm.
and believe that that's the thing that will cure all ills. It's actually an opportunity for us to think a lot more broadly. But
Yes.
I'm conscious we are just over time, and I should respect everyone else's time. My apologies to Pandeli that your hand's gone up after we've probably come to time, so I won't do that. What we will do is that with I don't know, the recording will be available. That first step,
Okay.
that's pretty simple.
Okay.
We'll also do a summary news story on the website, which of course will agree with Patricia before it does go up to share that. Patricia, if there are any links you want to share, I know Amelia Acker would be an obvious one given the
Right.
shout out that
Yes.
you've given. So we can also
Yeah.
do a little bit of a reading list for people who want to dig into
Sure.
some of these ideas.
Absolutely.
And
Do
again,
that.
it's challenging the ways we think about the futures, feeling the ability to actually have our own thoughts
Yeah.
and not take things as given. I think it's quite a powerful message that I know will be common across what we're trying to do over the year. But
Yeah.
any final things you want to mention, and then we'll let everyone continue with their
Uh,
day.
Only, just huge thanks to you, Stephen, and to everyone who was there. And hi, Rebecca. There's some colleagues online who attended, and I think Mark Matson may have also been online. But just, thank you so much for this opportunity. I hope that what I said was articulate and that the meetings got across. And if anyone would like to follow up, with questions or something, that would be fine with me. But really, truly, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'll just got to say, this is the first time I've ever done something like this at this length. I usually do a presentation, and then when you told me I didn't have to do a presentation, I'm like, oh, great, okay, let's have a free-flowing conversation. And it was lovely. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's your time, it's your inputs, it's your experience. So it's really great that you've been willing to share them and help us build this sort of awareness, readiness to think so proactively, confidently about the future and about where we're going as a field. But thank you so
Thank you.
much. So
Thank you.
wish you a very
Take
good
care.
rest of the day, and we'll
Oh,
get the recording up as soon as we can.
okay. Thank you so much,
Thanks.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.